Hello, and welcome to another exciting edition of the School Safety Free Period. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger.
And we are with the Educators School Safety Network. We are a national nonprofit organization, and we provide school safety training and professional development and resources and technical assistance to schools. And one of those resources is this very live stream or podcast, depending on how you're joining us. So we like to wave to folks who are joining us live on YouTube, and then we say enjoy your walk or your washing dishes and folding laundry for folks who are joining us on the podcast, because you probably aren't on a commute at the moment. So we are, this podcast, we are still serious and we're still academic, but we try to be a little bit less formal. So I think you had some things to talk to us today about the pandemic, if I'm correct.
I do. Today is Semantic Distinction Day.
Okay.
You didn't know it, but it's not official.
Okay.
There's no greeting cards for it or anything like that.
There could be.
I thought, since we've been talking about, a lot of things with the pandemic and a lot of things with safety related sort of stuff, I think it might be good to take a little bit of a step back and be a little bit more, reflective, tad bit. But I just have found some very interesting semantic distinctions that have come about that really need to kind of perhaps get into our decision-making framework, whether it's at the school level or classroom level or whatever that might be. So, are you ready?
I believe so.
Okay, the first one.
Well, can one ever truly be ready to talk about semantic distinctions? I don't know. I guess as ready as I'll ever be.
We should have had T-shirts for semantic distinction. I don't know what exactly, but another time.
Okay.
So the first one was an article that I was reading this week that I thought was really interesting, that was talking about this really critical, in the eye of the person writing it, which I also would tend to support, this really critical distinction between what we're currently doing, which is emergency remote instruction, versus online learning or distance learning. And we've seen lots of terms sort of bandied about. And I think in all of our podcasts, we've talked a little bit about the struggles that folks have been involved. And I think the parent tweets are frankly just hilarious. I mean, people are very funny. I know there's lots of downsides to social media, but there are some very funny observations coming out that are both funny, but also quite insightful. But I think it's a really interesting sort of thing to reflect on, of what are we really doing right now? Are we really doing distance learning? Are we really doing online education? Or are we in this emergency remote mode? And I just think that's really a critical distinction. So I thought I would throw that out for you and I to kind of talk about what would be some of the differences. What would we want to see differently if we could transition away from emergency remote instruction to actual online learning?
Well, I think, I can certainly speak to online learning. As a professor, I have always taught online. And it was never a surprise to me. It was always well ahead of time. You're going to be teaching this course and it's going to be online. And I think it's important, both that we give the leeway to teachers who were not given advance notice that they were going to be teaching online. And we're doing so in an emergency and responding to the need. But we can't do that forever. I mean, we have to start making contingency plans that it cannot be an emergency forever. We're going to have to start being able to allow our teachers the time and space to set themselves up for success for online learning, not emergency remote instruction.
Well, and I do think one of the critical components to that, to transitioning away from emergency online, which makes it sound like you should start every class with like a siren, like, it's time for emergency online instruction. But I think one of the things that really needs to happen for us to transition away from that is to be more intentional. We had a lot of instruction, emergency online instruction, that was sort of default instruction. I don't have any other choice but to do A. And I don't know what else to do, so I'm going to do B. And I'm not being critical of folks for doing that, because frankly, the fact that you're able to even in any way enact emergency online instruction is pretty phenomenal of what happens when you set educators loose and give them a mission.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's right up there with, Navy SEALs and,
Mm-hmm.
disaster mobilization teams, that you're able to move an entire sector of the population completely online in literally a matter of days. But I think that being intentional and being able to make choices about what we do is one piece. I think the other piece is really trying to strike that balance between, we're not going to ever be able to replicate sitting in a classroom together. Mm-hmm. So how do we get the best of both worlds? How do we pull those things in the face-to-face experience that are so crucial, that we must have that interaction of reading a story? And how do we jettison the things that are not valuable about face-to-face online instructions? And again, if I'm using a kindergarten motif here, the face-to-face interaction on the classroom rug as we read a story versus 25 kids lined up at the pencil sharpener, taking 25 minutes to put on our boots to go out to the bus. Those sort of things we don't miss in the online reality. So how do we get the best of those experiences? I think part of the problem is we have difficulty identifying what is the best about the distance learning piece. We all, as an online teacher and a face-to-face teacher, I can very easily identify the critical, wonderful components of a face-to-face interaction. It's harder, and we have fewer experiences identifying the really good parts of online instruction, where you, as primarily an online instructor, may find that to be much less of an arduous ask.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's also important, even in this discussion that we've just been having, we've sort of fallen into the pattern of thinking that either we're having normal school face-to-face instruction or we're online. And as we've talked about on this podcast and in other things, we're going to need to have that's going to have to exist on a continuum. And it might be that we're going to have normal school for 2 weeks, and then we need to be transitioning to remote learning for 2 weeks. And that we need to be able to find, or we've talked about staggered schedules, that maybe we'll have half the class will be here on Monday and Wednesday, and half the class will be in the building on Tuesday and Thursday, and on the other days folks are learning remotely. And so that's going to need to be part of that creative problem solving, is figuring out what are our constraints, and then how can we maximize the opportunity that we're afforded.
Yeah, and I haven't heard a lot of conversation about the strengths of distance learning that other than the thing we always rail against in school safety, which is the convenience of adults. Well, it's convenient to have online classes, and it gives us flexibility in our schedule, but we need to mine or look through or sort through and find what's the stuff about online distance learning that's really good for kids, as opposed to convenient, cost-effective, whatever those other things are. And so I'm not seeing that. Like, I think we need to start digging around in the drawer of online instruction and start pulling out the stuff that this really makes sense for kids.
Well, I think
that's not happening.
I mean, I think if nothing else, one of the easiest ones is the different pacing. You have different students learn at different paces, and how online or remote instruction is so much more conducive to that than being in a classroom. And I remember that from my own school experiences. I think I would have been very well served by being able to move through material at more of an individualized pace. And so that's, I think, an easy one to think of how can we leverage this opportunity that we have we have to be doing remote learning. So how can we leverage that making sure that students are able to work at a pace that fits them.
And the self-pacing you're talking about goes both ways. I can remember in an online statistics class way back in the day when it first became online, the joy of being able to rewind that video and have her explain for the 18th time how to do this problem that I couldn't wrap my head around. So I think that's a really good point, that it goes to both sides of that. The other thing that I haven't heard discussed, and you just alluded to it a little bit, is, we've talked about this half and half or staggered. Some people come to school on Monday, Wednesday, some people come Tuesday, Thursday. I haven't heard a lot of discussion about the idea of doing that simultaneously. So I have 25 kids in a class, and half of them are at home online and half of them are in the class. and we're all together doing things together. Some people are watching it, some people are doing it,
Mm-hmm.
and then we toggle back and forth to that the next day.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think what I'm beginning to hear is more of these obstacles of, hey, if you want to have small class size, you're going to have to hire twice as many teachers and we can't afford it. Well, maybe we can do it with our existing numbers if we can be more creative about being able to do things simultaneously, having online instruction and face-to-face happening at the same moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't seen a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah.
So that's our first distinction. The second one is the difference between physical distance and social distance. And we've talked about this a little bit briefly. We've talked a lot about, it's a new buzzword, I guess, of social distancing, and we want all those sort of things. But I think we need to be really cognizant of that really subtle but important distinction in schools. We are not trying to keep kids from being social with each other, because that's a critical part of their school experience. Mm-hmm. And I'm concerned about that we are creating this idea of you can't talk to other people, you can't be involved in other people. We need to keep this sort of closed society, which is already a problem, frankly, in some secondary schools. Mm-hmm. And we know from our work in safety what some of the terrible outcomes of that isolation are. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of deliberately choose the discussion of physical distance as opposed to social distance.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a way for the physical distance, those things where it's like an inflatable clear plastic thing, and they play soccer, like you're in that ball. You could put all the kids in one that was like 3 feet, and then.
Well, what do kids like more than the floor is lava? So if the floor is lava and it's 6 feet of lava in between us, I mean, okay, maybe that works. But I do think it's important for us to not, again, default to it's more convenient to keep kids apart. It's more convenient to do this and that. We have to make sure that if we're going to remove some social opportunities, that we're going to somehow replace them or provide opportunities that are not physical, but are social. And I'm not sure, and I would hate to see that default to purely a technological piece. Yeah. So anything else to say about that?
No, I think, you talk about defaulting to only technology solution, and you talk about the dangers of isolation, whether that's in high school students who perpetrate crimes because of extreme isolation and other factors, or whether that's just adults who feel very isolated. I think you're right, we cannot just throw only a technology solution at this. I think
the social part of it.
Yeah, I think the last 10 years of having smartphones and the accompanying decline in mental health metrics, generally speaking, would indicate to us that technology cannot replace face-to-face interactions, and it can supplant it, and it can help us, and it obviously a lot of technology has helped people during this difficult time, but in a long-term sense, we're going to need to find a way to have technology help when we really, really need it, and find alternative ways to connect with people as humans, as we have for thousands of years. Because
if you have a kid that has social issues, or you've got somebody that's been sitting in their house since March, and it's now August, and they've been in their house, or they have been, an only child or one kid, or, there've not been opportunities for taking turns and having to wait and doing all the things that we want kids to do to be able to have appropriate social interactions. You've got kids that are getting some deeply ingrained habits just by nature of the environment in which they've had to sit in for, 2 or 3 or 4 months. And so I think that social part of it is going to be even more critical, not less critical, when we finally get back into face-to-face sort of situations. Not to mention, spending half my life with middle school, there is no such thing as a social distance or a physical distance in middle school. It's essentially having a school with, 350 puppies.
I was going to say, it's like a puppy pile, one big puppy pile.
So, and then finally,
I don't envy the job of whoever has to disinfect the middle schools.
So finally, that's essentially every mom goes, yeah, I get it. I just do the 1 bedroom, let alone all of them. So finally, I think it's important to have this little bit of a distinction between what is doable, meaning we could do it, what's feasible, and then what's desirable. And I'm referring here to an article that I read that was a survey where, in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
so full disclosure. And they were surveying teachers in the UK about what they felt was feasible to do as they transitioned back to school.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll start with the extremes. The one thing that everyone agreed on, 72%, so it's a significant percent of people, thought that it was absolutely impossible to do social distancing in a school. I thought that was kind of surprising, because I would not have anticipated that would be the thing. I guess, and I'll read just briefly from the article. Social distancing would pretty much be impossible to manage in schools strictly and consistently all of the time because of the constraints on spaces and the reality that there is a mix of age groups and behaviors. Yeah, okay. If you want to be a purist about social distancing,
Right.
it probably is impossible. But I don't think it is impossible. I think it is feasible to some extent. And again, if we can subscribe to the metric that some social distancing is better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that one. I thought that was very interesting. But what they did agree that they thought was pretty feasible and doable were staggered breaks, dividing up the week, as you suggested, with kids coming in certain days of the week, bringing smaller numbers of high-risk populations or, that have intensive needs back first, to try to close some of those achievement gaps. And those were all between 66 and 69%, that they felt were really significant and doable. Less than 50%. So these are the things where half people go, no, you can't do that. Less than 50% were discouraging parents from coming into the school. Felt like that was not going to happen. Reducing class sizes. Felt like that was not going to happen. And staggering pupils' schedules and doing more creative things with scheduling than just like, the staggered start. I think they meant the start and arrival times. And I think that's really interesting because those three things, with less than 50% feeling it's feasible or doable, I think is really predicated on thinking from February of 2020, where we went, oh, parents would never stand for that.
Well, I get, it's important to hear voices from the field in the survey, but if you would have asked, hey, can we do emergency distance learning, emergency remote instruction on 4 days notice, 100% of people would say no, we couldn't. So
yeah, if you asked that on February 1, you would have had 150% saying nope, not possible.
How percentages work, but yes, it sounds difficult, but educators managed to do this.
But what I think is interesting about that is, again, using this doable, feasible, and desirable sort of metric, we don't have the limitations we had before. A parent right now would be, I'm not actively homeschooling my kids, but I'm going to go out on a limb and go, there's a lot of parents right now that if you could take their kid for like an hour and do some instruction that they didn't have to do, that would be pretty good. So it is kind of a sliding scale. Our expectations have significantly diminished. But also, I think parents have begun to realize that the traditional custodial function of, I give you my kid from 8 to 5, and I don't worry about it in between, that is largely significantly diminished. And so I think a lot of these things become much more feasible. But then the question becomes, just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. So now we're into the metric of desirable versus just feasible. And I think that's where we get into some more difficult conversations.
Cool. Well, I think that about wraps it up for today. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us on social media. You can find any of the other resources we talked about on our website, www.eschoolsafety.org. As always, if you are looking for other content where we're talking about the pandemic, or if you're talking about school safety from before the pandemic, you can always check out our YouTube channel with the different videos and all of the podcasts and resources that we have there. Anything else you wanted to add?
Just that, the school safety piece and the pandemic piece are not mutually exclusive. We need to always keep that in mind. We cannot just say we're going to focus on the pandemic and worry about school safety later.
Yeah.
We need to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time.
Yeah. So there you have it, and until next time, thanks. I have to wait a little bit to end the live stream.